The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from The Elephant in the Dark by Idries Shah. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. It was nearly 3 decades later, at the most important occasion of Muhammad's life, that another Christian, an Arab, devout and well-versed in the scriptures, a man who had sought the Hafanite path, entered his life. This was in the year AD 610, when Muhammad, in the cave on Mount Hira, received his first spiritual experience, and feared that he had gone mad or become, as he said, a poet. When the voice addressed him, he went to his wife in Mecca, trembling with fear, saying, "Woe is me, poet or possessed!" He had even thought of casting himself down from the high rocks to kill himself. Muhammad thought that people would never believe what he had to say, but she reminded him that he was of impeccable character and was known by the title of Al-Amin, the Truthful. She took her husband at once to her cousin, Waraqah, son of Nofal, the devout Christian, for his advice. Waraqah heard the account of the voice and what it had said, and cried out, "By the most holy God, if what thou hast said is true, this is the voice of the angel who appeared to Moses. Doubt me not, thy husband, Khadijah, is the prophet risen out of the tribe of the Quraysh." And he said to Muhammad, "Would that I were to be in the land of the living when thy kinsman sends thee into exile. Whoever brings what thou bringest falls victim to a most dastardly persecution." Shah Sardar Iqbal Ali, Muhammad the Prophet, London, Wright and Brown, 1st edition, 1932. The voice had said, preserved in the Quran, 74:1 and following, "O thou enwrapped in thy mantle, arise and warn." The interchange between Christians and Muslims, marked by the recognition of the overwhelming importance of the concept of submission to the will of God, has been continuously present for the past 14 centuries. One has only to read Evelyn Underhill, The Authority on Christian Mysticism, The Mystic Way, London 1913, to see how she constantly mentions Sufi psychology and its affinity in results with Christian devotion. Muhammad's words to Bahira at the age of 12 speak of his submission to God alone. Waraqah's welcome of him was based upon his repetition of the injunction of the angel to obey God. The Ethiopian king's acceptance of the Muslims was rooted in their account of their efforts to submit, to surrender to those principles which had been preached to them. The dialogue, which we characterize in the title of these discussions as an attempt to dialogue, starts before the proclamation of Islam, continues through the infancy of Islam and the period of the supremacy of the Muslims in the East, is to be found in the mutual respect during the Crusades, in Muslim Spain, where so very many Christian scholars, including at least one pope, Gerbert, studied, and it survived the colonist period from which we have just emerged. This Crusades aspect is, of course, abundantly covered in many books and is a matter of common knowledge. When Usman bin Muqid, a Syrian emir of the 12th century, visited Jerusalem during a period of truce in the Second Crusade, the Knights Templar, who had occupied the Masjid al-Aqsa, the farthest mosque near the Dome of the Rock, assigned to him a small chapel adjoining it for him to say his prayers in, and they strongly resented the interference on the part of a newly arrived crusader, who took this new departure in the direction of religious freedom in very bad part. Arnold Sir Thomas, quoting Guizot, Histoire de la civilisation en Europe, Paris, 1882. Gerbert, the Pope, was Sylvester II, AD 999. See Hitti, History of the Arabs. It is to be found both in the writings and speech of contemporary Muslim and Christian thinkers and of workers in these communities in the political, economic, scientific, and human fields. Contemporary Western thinkers do not disdain the possibility of understanding still to be developed from thinking, such as that of such great intellects and mystics as Al-Ghazali, of whom we shall have more to say later, in recognition of the common problems which face believers today. In the words of Professor W. Montgomery Watt of Edinburgh, the distinguished Arabist, in The Faith and Practice of Al-Ghazali, London, 1963, Islam is now wrestling with Western thought as it once wrestled with Greek philosophy, and is as much in need as it was then of revival of the religious sciences. Deep study of Al-Ghazali may suggest to Muslims steps to be taken if they are to deal successfully with the contemporary situation. Christians, too, now that the world is a cultural melting pot, must be prepared to learn from Islam, and are unlikely to find a more sympathetic guide than Al-Ghazali. Ghazali died in the year 1111. The allusion is to his book, The Ihya, Revival of Religious Sciences, which we quote below. Now I would like to pause to consider some of the ways in which Muslims think of Allah, God whom they worship and to whose will submission, surrender, is their goal. In the words of one of the best-known parts of the merciful Quran, the throne verse, Quran Baqarah 2, 255. Allah, there is no deity but He, the living, the eternal being, no slumber overtakes Him, nor sleep. His is what is in the heavens and on earth. Who can intercede with Him except with His leave? He knows all that is before them and after them, and they have none of His knowledge except what He wills, and His throne extends over the heavens and the earth, and its protection is no burden to Him, and He is the Most High and the Most Great. Another of the most repeated passages is Surah 24, the Light, verse 35, known as the Light verse, which refers to God in the analogy of illumination, and which has been taken by many of the Muslim mystics such as Al-Ghazali in their attempt to teach the path of surrender to the will of Allah. God is the light of the heavens and of the earth. His light may be compared to a niche within which is a lamp, the lamp within a crystal like a star. It is lit from a blessed olive tree, neither of the east nor of the west. Its very oil would be well nigh luminous, though fire touched it not. Light upon light. Allah guides to His light whom He will. This is the text upon which Ghazali's celebrated treatise Mishkat an-Anwar, The Niche of Lights, is based. These major texts are traditionally those which have been used for contemplation by Muslim mystics who follow the path of surrender. Stories of Jesus and references to Him abound in the Quran, in the traditions of the Prophet, and in the devotional and psychological literature of Islam. Some of these are well known to Christians through their own Gospels, others are less familiar to them. As teacher of salvation through submission, Jesus is often held up as a model. One would write a book or talk for months about this aspect of the tradition. But one small sample of how Jesus is cited in Islam as teaching through words and actions, in illustrating on the mortal plane by positive action the rewards of submission to God, I choose this brief extract from Ihya al-Ulum, the Revival of Religious Sciences by Al-Ghazali. It is narrated that Jesus, on whom be peace, saw a blind leper who was saying, "Praise to God, who has saved me from many things which have befallen others." "From what affliction art thou free?" Jesus asked him. "Spirit of God," said the leper, I am better off than those who do not know God." "You speak truly," said Jesus. "Stretch out your hand." He put out his hand and instantly was restored to perfect health through the power of God. And he followed Jesus and worshipped with him. This demonstration teaching, as one might name it, may be seen to have an equivalence, whether this be on a lower plane or not, in social action as well as in the spiritual discipline of which we will speak later. Bringing ourselves right up to the present day, and transposing into an area within our own daily concern and competence of action, we may note the thought of one of our contemporary great men who sees no obstacle to interpreting surrender in terms of arming ourselves to carry out human missions. Surrender to God must mean a surrender to the principles which represent, are derived from, and analogous to, those of the highest ideals of that which is good. This surrender, therefore, can be, and indeed must be, expressed in social and psychological and other terms, as well as in distinctly devotional ones, confined to religious specialization within ideological communities, sects, or institutions claiming exclusivity. An example of this in the social, legal, and political field is given by one of Islam's most distinguished thinkers and men of action, the statesman Abd al-Rahman Azam Pasha, in The Eternal Message of Muhammad, New York, 1965, whose name and thought are known and respected throughout Islam. "It is our right, we, the descendants of just, equitable, and merciful people in the East, as Muslims and as Christians, to strive for a rebirth in which we shall serve as examples and spokesmen for freedom of belief and of opinion in a world that has become intolerant of those who differ in their views. Our forefathers were the protectors of this freedom and its supreme example. Let us inherit this tolerance, and let us bear its standard." In this sense, the service of man is the service of God, and discharging our duty to man is fulfilling God's commands, and hence surrendering to what he has commanded us to do. One of the great Islamic mystic authors, the classical Persian poet Sa'di, says in a famous passage, "The way is not otherwise than in the service of the people. It is not in rosaries and prayer rugs and robes." Bostan 1. In this sense, too, the dialogue is already in being, for Muslims and Christians already work together throughout the world, though not everywhere or always, on tasks which are rooted in an acceptance of the commands of God to all, and hence in surrender. This can, of course, only be a voluntary task, which can never be imposed. Imposition of service, in the sense in which Muslims and Christians alike understand it, is an absurdity, an impossibility. Islam, the very word meaning submission, means freedom and choice in service in its perceptible as well as in its interior senses. This is so important that it is written in a famous passage in the Quran, which of course has the force of law for all Muslims. "Wilt thou compel man to become believers? No soul can believe but by the leave of God." And perhaps even more familiar, at least to Muslims, is the command, "Let there be no compulsion in religion." This podcast is copyright 2016, The Idries Shah Foundation.